The morning mist hung thick over Brooklyn Heights on August 27, 1776, as General George Washington stood surveying the defenses. His Continental Army had hastily constructed what he couldn't see through that gray veil would soon become the Patriots' greatest nightmare mass of British force, preparing to deliver a crushing blow that would nearly end the American Revolution. Before it truly began, the stage for disaster had been set weeks earlier when British General William Howe landed his formidable army on Staten Island. With over 32,000 troops at his disposal, including battle-hardened Hessian mercenaries, Howe commanded the largest expeditionary force in British history. His fleet of 400 ships darkened New York Harbor like storm clouds, carrying not just soldiers, but the full weight of the British Empire's determination. To crush this colonial rebellion, Washington found himself trapped in an impossible position. After the Patriots' surprising victory at Boston, the Continental Congress had ordered him to defend New York City at all costs. The strategic importance was undeniable. Whoever controlled New York controlled the vital Hudson River corridor that connected New England to the southern colonies. Lose New York, and the rebellion could be split in half. Yet Washington's army was a pale shadow compared to Howe's professional forces. The Continental Army numbered barely 19,000 men, many of them raw militia who had never seen real combat. They lacked proper uniforms, adequate supplies, and most critically, experienced officers who understood large-scale battlefield tactics. These were farmers and shopkeepers playing at being soldiers, facing off against the world's most powerful military machine. The first critical error came in Washington's decision to divide his already outnumbered forces. Against the advice of several subordinates, he stationed nearly half his army on Long Island, with the remainder defending Manhattan. This violation of the basic military principle of concentration of force would prove catastrophic. As military historian David McCullough noted in his acclaimed work on 1776, this decision reflected Washington's inexperience in commanding large formations and his dangerous tendency to try defending everything simultaneously. Brooklyn's terrain should have favored the defenders. The western end of Long Island featured a series of wooded hills and ridges that could provide natural defensive positions. But these same hills that might have been assets became death traps. When inadequately defended and poorly coordinated, the Patriots established their main line along Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the East River. With forward positions scattered across the Gowanus Heights, General Israel Putnam commanded the Long Island forces, but the real authority was fragmented among several officers who had never worked together in a major engagement. John Sullivan controlled the center. William Alexander, who styled himself Lord Sterling, held the right flank, and various militia commanders filled gaps with their local units. This patchwork command structure lacked the unity of purpose essential for coordinated defense. As British ships continued arriving throughout August, Washington's intelligence network painted an increasingly grim picture. Loyalist spies moved freely through the region, providing Howe with detailed information about Patriot positions and troop strengths. Meanwhile, Washington's own intelligence efforts remained primitive and unreliable, leaving him largely blind to British intentions and capabilities. The approaching storm would test every assumption the Patriots held about warfare, leadership, and their chances for independence. On the night of August 26, 1776, British Admiral Richard Howe's warships began their final positioning in Gravesend Bay. The younger brother of General William Howe commanded the Royal Navy's most formidable fleet, and his vessels now formed an impenetrable barrier cutting off any Patriot escape by sea. Yet it was not the naval blockade that would doom the Continental Army on Long Island. It was a failure of basic military intelligence that would prove nearly fatal to the American cause. The Patriot commanders had identified four main passes through the Gowanus Heights: the Gowanus Road on the right, the Flatbush Road in the center, the Bedford Road toward the left, and the Jamaica Road on the far left flank. 3 of these passes were adequately defended, with Continental troops and militia positioned to contest any British advance. But the Jamaica Road, the most critical passage of all, remained virtually unguarded due to a catastrophic oversight. In reconnaissance and communication, General John Sullivan, commanding the Patriot left wing, had received conflicting reports about the Jamaica Pass. Some local guides insisted it was too remote and difficult for a major force to traverse. Others warned that it provided the most direct route to the Patriot rear. In the confusion of divided command and poor communication, Sullivan made the fatal decision to leave only a token force of 5 volunteer officers To watch this crucial avenue of approach, meanwhile, General William Howe had spent weeks perfecting his battle plan with meticulous British attention to detail. His strategy was elegant in its simplicity, while diversionary attacks pinned down Patriot forces. At the Gowanus and Flatbush passes, the main British force would execute a massive, flanking movement through the Jamaica Pass. It was a classic example of 18th century European warfare applied to American terrain, and it should have been exactly the kind of maneuver that colonial militia could anticipate and counter with their superior knowledge of local geography. The intelligence failure extended beyond mere tactical oversight. Throughout August, British agents had systematically mapped every road, path, and farm trail on western Long Island. They interviewed loyalist farmers, studied captured Patriot correspondents, and even conducted reconnaissance flights with observation balloons of cutting-edge technology. That gave them an unprecedented aerial view of the battlefield. The Patriots, by contrast, relied primarily on local militia officers who often contradicted each other and lacked any systematic method for gathering and analyzing information. Colonel Samuel Miles commanded the token Patriot force watching the Jamaica Pass, but his 5 officers were spread so thin across the approach routes that they could barely maintain visual contact with each other when British light infantry began probing the pass during the pre-dawn hours of August 27th. Miles's men initially mistook them for fellow Patriots conducting their own reconnaissance. By the time they realized their error, General Henry Clinton was already leading 10,000 British and Hessian troops through the pass in a column that stretched for miles. The weather worked against the Patriots as well. The same morning fog that concealed British movements also prevented Patriot sentries from maintaining visual communication between their scattered positions. Signal fires that might have warned of the flanking movement were invisible in the mist, and mounted messengers became lost on unfamiliar roads. The primitive communication systems that had served adequately in smaller engagements proved completely inadequate for coordinating the defense of such an extended position. Back at Brooklyn Heights, General Israel Putnam received fragmentary and contradictory reports throughout the early morning hours. Some messengers reported heavy fighting at the Gowanus Pass. Others claimed the main attack was developing at Flatbush. None mentioned the massive British column that was already deep in the Patriot rear, preparing to spring the trap that would destroy half the Continental Army. In a single morning's fighting, the stage was set for military catastrophe. Part 3. The hammer strike storm broke gray and ominous over Long Island on August 27th, 1776, as the sound of musket fire erupted from the Gowanus Pass. General William Alexander, the self-styled Lord Sterling, led his Maryland and Delaware Continental troops forward to meet what appeared to be the main British assault. The steady crash of volleys echoed across the wooded hills as disciplined lines of redcoats advanced up the slopes, their bayonets glinting in the morning light. But this fierce fighting was merely the anvil. The hammer was already falling elsewhere. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, the thunderous sound of British artillery announced the springing of General William Howe's carefully laid trap. The massive flanking column that had moved undetected through the Jamaica Pass burst from the woods behind the Patriot left wing, catching General John Sullivan's forces in complete disarray. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Patriot militia, who had been facing south toward the expected British advance, suddenly found themselves under attack from the north and east. Panic spread like wildfire through the inexperienced ranks as soldiers realized they were surrounded. The careful defensive positions that had seemed so strong moments before became death traps. As British forces poured through gaps in the Patriot line, General Henry Clinton, leading the British flanking force, demonstrated the professional competence that would make him one of Britain's most effective commanders in America. His troops deployed from column into line with mechanical precision, their movements coordinated by trumpet calls and disciplined training that the Patriot militia could not match. Hessian Jugers, expert marksmen recruited from German hunting grounds, picked out Patriot officers with deadly accuracy, further accelerating the collapse of organized resistance. The sound of bagpipes added an otherworldly quality to the carnage, as Scottish Highland regiments charged with their traditional ferocity. Their distinctive war cries terrified militia who had never faced such professional soldiers, and many Patriot units began dissolving before the Highlanders even reached their positions. The careful defensive plan that had looked adequate on paper crumbled within minutes when confronted with the reality of 18th century shock tactics. General John Sullivan attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal, but his scattered forces lacked the training and leadership necessary for such a complex maneuver under fire. Units became separated in the dense woods, communication broke down entirely, and what should have been an orderly retreat became a rout. Sullivan himself was captured while trying to rally stragglers, leaving his command without unified leadership. At the most critical moment of the battle, meanwhile, Lord Stirling's troops at the Gowanus Pass found themselves fighting not just the British forces to their front, but also Clinton's flanking column that was now attacking their rear. Caught between two fires, these Continental soldiers among the best trained in Washington's army faced the choice between surrender and annihilation. Stirling chose to fight, leading his Maryland regiment in a series of desperate charges that would become legendary in American military history. The Maryland 400, as they would be remembered, made charge after charge against overwhelming odds, buying precious time for other Patriot forces to escape across Gowanus Creek. Their sacrifice was magnificent and futile. Nearly two-thirds of the regiment was killed or captured, but their courage allowed hundreds of other Continental soldiers to avoid the trap that was closing around them. As British and Hessian forces converged on Brooklyn Heights, the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent. What had begun as a defensive battle had become a race for survival, with the remnants of the Continental Army's Long Island force streaming back toward their fortified positions. In growing panic and disorder, the British had achieved in a single morning what they had failed to accomplish in months of siege warfare around Boston. They had shattered a major Patriot force in open battle. General Washington, watching from across the East River, could only observe helplessly as his army disintegrated before his eyes. The retreat toward Brooklyn Heights became a nightmare of confusion and heroism, as shattered Patriot units struggled to escape the closing British trap. Gowanus Creek, normally a peaceful waterway meandering through salt marshes, transformed into a killing ground where Continental soldiers faced a terrible choice: surrender to British bayonets or risk drowning in the treacherous tidal waters. Lord Stirling's Maryland regiment had bought precious time with their blood, but that time was rapidly running out. British General James Grant, commanding the coastal assault, pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. His troops advanced methodically, using their superior discipline to maintain formation while pursuing the fleeing Patriots. The Redcoats had learned from earlier encounters with colonial forces they would not allow emotion or bloodlust to break their ranks and give the Americans an opportunity to rally. The geography that had seemed to favor the defenders now worked against them. Gowanus Creek's muddy banks and uncertain depths became obstacles. That claim lives as surely as British muskets. Men weighed down by equipment and weakened by hours of fighting found themselves unable to swim the 40-foot-wide channel. Some drowned outright, while others struggled halfway across only to be shot down by British marksmen. Lining the opposite shore, General Israel Putnam, commanding the overall defense of Long Island, arrived on the scene too late to organize an effective rear guard. The fog of war had prevented him from understanding the full scope of the British flanking movement until the trap had already sprung. Now he could only try to salvage what remained of his command while preventing a complete collapse that would open the road to Brooklyn Heights. The Hessian troops, fighting alongside their British allies, brought a particularly aggressive approach to the pursuit. These German mercenaries had crossed the Atlantic to fight for pay rather than principle, but they were professional soldiers of the highest caliber. Their disciplined advance contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate Patriot retreat, and their presence added weight to the British assault that the Americans simply could not match. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as part of a New York artillery battery, witnessed the carnage from the Patriot fortified lines on Brooklyn Heights. Years later, he would describe the scene as one of the most harrowing of the entire Revolutionary War. Continental soldiers stumbled into the fortifications exhausted, wounded, and demoralized, their accounts painting a picture of military disaster that threatened to end the rebellion before it could properly begin. Among the most tragic casualties was General William Woodhull, commander of the Long Island Militia, who was captured while attempting to organize local resistance behind British lines. The British initially promised him proper treatment as a prisoner of war, but loyalist militiamen seeking revenge for earlier Patriot raids murdered him. While in British custody, his death symbolized the bitter Civil War dimension of the conflict, where neighbor fought neighbor with a viciousness that often exceeded the formal warfare between regular armies. The collapse of organized resistance on Long Island had strategic implications far beyond the immediate battlefield. British control of western Long Island gave them advanced positions for artillery, that could threaten Patriot fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. More critically, it demonstrated to wavering colonists throughout the region that the Continental Army could be defeated decisively by professional European forces. As the afternoon wore on, General William Howe faced a crucial decision. His forces had achieved a stunning tactical victory, capturing or killing nearly 1,500 Patriot soldiers, while suffering fewer than 400 casualties themselves. British and Hessian troops were now positioned to assault the main Patriot fortifications on Brooklyn Heights, potentially ending the rebellion with a single decisive blow. The question was whether to press the attack immediately or consolidate the day's gains and prepare for a more methodical siege. Howe's decision would determine whether August 27, 1776, would be remembered as the day the American Revolution died or merely as its darkest hour. The fate of the Continental Army and American independence hung in the balance. General William Howe stood at the crossroads of history as the afternoon sun began its descent over the carnage of Long Island. Before him lay Brooklyn Heights, where the remnants of Washington's Continental Army cowered behind hastily constructed earthworks. A single, decisive assault could potentially crush the rebellion before it gained momentum, ending what many in London still considered a temporary colonial tantrum rather than a serious threat to British rule. The tactical situation could hardly have been more favorable for the British commander. His forces controlled the high ground around the Patriot fortifications. His artillery was already being positioned to dominate the American positions, and the morale of his troops was at its peak following their morning victory. The Continental soldiers visible within the Brooklyn Heights fortifications appeared demoralized and disorganized, many still streaming in from their defeat in the outer defenses. Yet Howe hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the seed of ultimate British defeat. In America, the general who had demonstrated such tactical brilliance in planning the morning's flanking movement now fell victim to the same methodical European approach to warfare that had served him well on traditional battlefields but was ill-suited to the revolutionary conflict he faced. Several factors influenced Howe's fateful decision to halt his advance. The memory of Bunker Hill loomed large in British military thinking. That costly victory had demonstrated that even poorly trained colonial forces could exact a terrible price when fighting from prepared positions. Howe had no desire to repeat the experience of marching his men into the teeth of defensive positions. That might cost him hundreds of casualties even in victory. The latter also played a role in Howe's calculations. Professional European armies of the 18th century rarely conducted major assaults in the gathering darkness, when confusion and friendly fire incidents could easily occur. The British commander calculated that his forces would be more effective attacking fresh in the morning, after a night's rest and proper reconnaissance of the Patriot positions. Perhaps most significantly, Howe believed he had already achieved his strategic objective. The defeat of the Continental Army on Long Island had demonstrated British military superiority and would surely discourage further colonial resistance. Why risk unnecessary casualties in a hasty assault when time and siege tactics would accomplish the same result with minimal cost? This patient approach had served British forces well in Europe, where fortified positions regularly fell to methodical siege warfare. What Howe failed to appreciate was the unique nature of the American conflict and the resourcefulness of his opponent, George Washington. Watching the British deployment from his command post on Brooklyn Heights, understood that his army faced annihilation if it remained trapped on Long Island. The Continental forces lacked the supplies for a prolonged siege, and British naval superiority made reinforcement or resupply impossible. As darkness fell on August 27th, Washington made perhaps the most crucial decision of his military career. Rather than wait passively for the inevitable British assault, he would attempt to evacuate his entire army across the East River to Manhattan, under cover of darkness. It was a desperate gamble that required perfect coordination, favorable weather, and a healthy dose of luck. The logistical challenges were staggering. Nearly 9,000 Continental soldiers, along with their equipment, supplies, and wounded, would have to be ferried across a mile of tidal water without alerting British sentries. The operation would require every available boat in the region, from fishing vessels to merchant craft, all coordinated in darkness while maintaining absolute silence. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, composed primarily of Massachusetts fishermen and sailors, would play the crucial role in this desperate evacuation. These men possessed the maritime skills necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of the East River in darkness. But even their expertise would be tested by the scale of the Operation Washington, envisioned as preparations began in secret throughout the Patriot fortifications. A providential fog began to roll in from the harbor. This natural concealment would prove as valuable as any military asset in the coming hours, hiding American movements from British observation posts and buying precious time for the evacuation to proceed. The stage was set for one of the most audacious military withdrawals in history. The fog that had concealed British movements during the morning battle now served as divine providence for the Continental Army's desperate escape. As darkness fell on August 27, 1776, a thick mist rolled in from New York Harbor, shrouding Brooklyn Heights in an impenetrable veil that would make the difference between salvation and annihilation for Washington's trapped forces. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment had already begun assembling every available watercraft along the Brooklyn shore. These hardy New England fishermen worked with quiet efficiency, their lifetime of experience on dangerous Atlantic waters now serving the cause of American independence. Fishing boats, ferries, merchant vessels, and even small rowboats were pressed into service for the most crucial evacuation in American military history. The operation required unprecedented coordination and discipline from troops who had been thoroughly demoralized just hours earlier. Washington's staff officers moved silently through the fortifications, whispered orders passing from unit to unit with instructions that seemed impossible to execute. The entire army was to withdraw in perfect silence, leaving behind campfires burning and sentries posted to maintain the illusion of continued occupation. General Thomas Mifflin commanded the rear guard, a position that required nerves of steel and absolute reliability. His Pennsylvania troops would be the last to leave Brooklyn Heights, maintaining defensive positions until the final moment to prevent British discovery of the evacuation. If detected too early, the entire Continental Army could be destroyed while strung out along the waterfront in a defenseless position. The first units began moving toward the ferry points at 10 o'clock in the evening, their footsteps muffled by careful attention to noise discipline that would have seemed impossible for militia forces just days earlier. Officers rapped their swords to prevent clanking, while soldiers patted their equipment and moved in single file along predetermined routes to the embarkation points. The weather continued to favor the desperate American gamble. Not only did the fog provide concealment, but the wind patterns created ideal conditions for the sailing vessels that formed the backbone of the evacuation fleet. Experienced mariners like Captain William Pry of Salem worked tirelessly throughout the night, making trip after trip across the East River with loads of Continental soldiers who had never imagined they would owe their lives to New England seamanship. British sentries, positioned just hundreds of yards away, remained unaware of the massive movement taking place under cover of darkness. The careful maintenance of normal routines within the Patriot fortifications, including the continuation of regular patrol schedules and the maintenance of campfires, successfully deceived British observers, who had no reason to suspect such an audacious evacuation attempt. As the night progressed, the operation took on an almost supernatural quality. Entire regiments disappeared into the fog like ghosts, their passage marked only by the gentle splash of oars and the quiet commands of boat crews. Washington himself remained on Brooklyn Heights until nearly dawn, personally overseeing the withdrawal and ensuring that no unit was forgotten in the desperate race against time. The most dangerous moment came just before sunrise, when the fog began to lift prematurely, threatening to expose the final phase of the evacuation to British observation. General Mifflin's rear guard still held their positions, but hundreds of Continental soldiers remained on the Brooklyn shore awaiting transport. Discovery at this point would have meant certain capture or death for these men. Then, as if summoned by divine intervention, the fog rolled back and thicker than ever, providing just enough additional concealment for the last boats to complete their crossings. By 7 o'clock on the morning of August 28th, the final Continental soldier had been evacuated from Long Island, leaving behind only empty fortifications and cold campfires to mark what had been one of the largest concentrations of American military force. British patrols entering the abandoned Patriot positions found evidence of hasty departure, but could scarcely believe that an entire army had vanished overnight. The successful evacuation represented a logistical and tactical achievement that astonished military observers on both sides of the Atlantic and provided the Continental Army with a second chance to continue the fight for independence. The morning of August 28, 1776, Dawn quiet over Brooklyn Heights as British patrols cautiously entered the abandoned Patriot fortifications. General William Howe's officers could scarcely believe the evidence before their eyes. An entire army had vanished in the night, leaving behind only smoldering campfires and empty earthworks. The tactical victory that had seemed so complete just hours earlier now felt hollow, as the strategic prize had slipped through British fingers like morning mist. The Battle of Long Island would be remembered as both a crushing defeat and a miraculous salvation for the Continental Army. Nearly 1,500 Patriot soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the fighting, including to general officers and numerous experienced company commanders whose loss would be felt throughout the remaining years of the war. Yet the preservation of the Army's core, those 9,000 Continental soldiers who escaped across the East River, meant that the American Revolution would continue. Despite this devastating setback, the lessons learned in blood on Long Island would reshape American military thinking for the remainder of the conflict. Washington and his surviving officers came to understand that they could not meet British forces in conventional European-style battles where superior training and discipline would inevitably triumph. The Continental Army's future lay not in defending fixed positions or fighting pitched battles, but in mobility, guerrilla tactics, and the patient wearing down of British resolve through prolonged resistance. The intelligence failure that had doomed the Patriot defense became a cautionary tale that would influence American military practice for generations. Never again would Washington divide his forces so drastically when facing superior numbers, and never again would such crucial terrain features as the Jamaica Pass be left so inadequately defended. The painful education in military reconnaissance and communication would eventually produce an American intelligence network that would prove superior to British efforts. For the British, the Battle of Long Island represented a missed opportunity that would haunt their conduct of the war. General Howe's decision to halt his assault on Brooklyn Heights rather than pressing his advantage became a subject of intense debate among military historians. The methodical European approach that prioritized minimizing casualties over achieving decisive results would characterize British strategy throughout the conflict, ultimately allowing the Continental Army time to recover from each defeat and return to fight again. The role of geography and weather in determining military outcomes was never more clearly demonstrated than in the Long Island campaign. The same fog that had initially concealed British movements during the battle later provided salvation for the retreating Americans. The lesson was clear in warfare, as in life. Fortune often favors the bold and the desperate over the cautious and the methodical. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For the British, the easy victory confirmed their assumptions about American military incompetence and reinforced their belief that the rebellion could be crushed through conventional military pressure. This confidence would lead to strategic decisions that ultimately proved counterproductive, including the policy of relying heavily on loyalist support. That proved far less reliable than anticipated. For the Americans, the disaster at Long Island paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened the revolutionary cause in the long term. The successful evacuation became a symbol of American resourcefulness and divine providence, while the sacrifice of units like the Maryland 400 provided martyrs whose memory would inspire future generations of Continental soldiers. The battle demonstrated that Americans could fight courageously even in defeat, a crucial psychological foundation for the long struggle ahead. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Long Island established the pattern that would characterize much of the Revolutionary War. British tactical victories followed by strategic frustrations, American defeats that somehow strengthened rather than weakened the cause of independence. In losing the battle but saving his army, Washington had learned the most crucial lesson of revolutionary warfare. Survival itself was victory when facing a superior conventional force. The fog that had shrouded Brooklyn Heights on that August night in 1776 would lift to reveal not the end of American hopes, but their transformation into something far more dangerous to British rule, a cause that could survive military defeat and emerge stronger from the crucible of adversity.